Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to explain why the only way to cut your taxes is to raise tax. Alright, so this week was going to be my last ever weekly video on Gary's Economics. But I figured I've got just enough energy to squeeze one more in before I bow out. So we're pushing off the soppy emotional video to next week. And this week we are going to answer one of the biggest economic mysteries of our time, which is if it is true, and it broadly is true, that here in the UK we have the highest taxes in 70 or 80 years, how is it possible that we also have public services which have been dramatically cut in the last 20, 30 years? How can it be that we simultaneously have very high taxes and dramatically decreased public services? And we are going to explain today why the only way to fix that, the only way to cut your taxes, is to raise taxes on other people. Just a couple of quick shout outs before I start. The Channel 4 documentary, How to Get Filthy Rich with Gary Stevenson, is now available on YouTube. We'll stick a link. Unfortunately, it is geo-blocked to the UK, so unless you can figure out some way to get around a geo-block, you won't be able to watch it. So call your local TV companies and ask them to buy the rights. We also have a massive shout out to Gabriel Zucman, who has finally been allowed on The Rest Is Politics. We'll put a link to that. He did a fantastic job advocating for wealth taxes on The Rest Is Politics. I think it's amazing to have the documentary out and Zucman coming out at the same time. It's a fantastic moment. So really, at the moment, it feels here in the UK like everybody is talking about wealth taxes. Everybody's talking about the documentary. So watch it if you haven't seen it, share it, and watch Zucman on Rest Is Politics, and let's pressure Andy Burnham, the new Prime Minister, to do something about wealth taxes. All right, that's shout outs done. Now let's explain why the only way to cut taxes is to raise tax. All right, the reason that I wanted to squeeze one more in now is because I think this basic discussion cuts through this sort of stupid dichotomy that we have on tax at the moment, which kind of pretends the only tax options that we have are low taxes for everyone or high taxes for everyone, which is a kind of stupid, like imaginary idea that gets put around a lot. When I say tax the very, very rich, the media tries to pretend I'm trying to tax you. I think when we look at trying to understand why taxes on working people are high, we start to understand that actually your high taxes are related to their low taxes. So it's a great opportunity to cut through this kind of stupid false dichotomy which keeps being made on taxes. It's another great story which really explains really clearly the importance of wealth and wealth ownership and the wealth distribution. And it also explains this really interesting thing about how the dissaving of public wealth and also the dissaving of middle class and working class wealth has really disguised and delayed these falls in living standards which we have seen incredibly powerfully in the last few years. All right, it's not going to be a super long one today, and largely that is because if you want to understand why taxes are so high, the only thing you really need to look at is this one graph, which we have used many times on this series, which is Gabriel Zucman's graph on changing government wealth over time. And if you look at this graph, what you can see is that in the last 40, 50 years, Western governments, including the British government, have gone from being large-scale holders of large amounts of wealth. And the British government used to own as much wealth as 100% of GDP, the equivalent of everything the UK economy produces in 1 year. And that has fallen over time to less than negative 100% of GDP. Once again, it is important to understand what that wealth is. This is a point which I again make very, very frequently on this channel. This is not just money in a bank account. Government wealth used to be things that the government needed to provide government services. So the most obvious things are things like hospitals and things like schools and things like council housing. So back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the UK government, like most Western governments, owned a large stock of this real wealth: schools, hospitals, homes. And that made it much easier and more affordable for the government to provide you, citizens of Western nations, with things like healthcare, education, and housing. Now, obviously, when you see government wealth fall as it has done into the negative numbers, that should be a signal to you that government wealth is not just about ownership of real things, because it is not possible to own a negative amount of real things. Government wealth also includes debt. So what you should see when government wealth has fallen significantly below zero is two things. The government no longer owns a big chunk of the hospitals, the schools, the housing that it used to use to provide you with healthcare and education and housing. And now it is massively in debt. The amount of the UK government debt is about 100% of GDP. It's something like 40 or 50,000 pounds per UK adult. And as you are probably aware, if you do not own 40 or 50,000 pounds of government debt, somebody else does, that money is largely owed to the very rich. Once you understand this, that the UK government and other governments like the American government, the German government, the French, Italian governments, all of these governments used to own significant amounts of real wealth, which were things like hospitals, schools, and housing that they used to provide you with healthcare, education, and housing, and now they don't. It should become really quite quickly very obvious why your taxes have to be high. If I am the government and I own all of the hospitals and I own all of the schools and I own a big chunk of the housing, it is not incredibly expensive for me to provide you with healthcare, housing, and education because I own the hospitals, I own the schools, and I own the houses. It's not free, of course, because I still need to provide, I still need to pay for teachers, I still need to pay for doctors and surgeons and all of these things, but it's an awful lot cheaper when I own the buildings. If I don't own the buildings, then I need to rent the buildings. And if I need to rent the buildings, then it's going to be more expensive for me as the government to provide you with healthcare, to provide you with housing, to provide you with education. So if I'm going to provide you with the same quality of healthcare, education, and housing as I used to do when I owned all of the assets needed to provide those things, quite simply, I am going to have to charge you significantly more in tax. And that is without even considering the debt. So government wealth is now significantly below 0% of GDP. It's significantly negative. That means not only do I not own the assets, now I'm significantly in debt. And if I'm in debt, that means I need to pay debt interest to the rich. Debt interest to the rich is now incredibly high. And that is another thing which I need to get from somewhere. It's another form of income I need to get from somewhere, which means in order to really, regardless whether I provide you public services or not, I now need to charge you the regular taxpayer tax just to pay the rich interest every year. There is a broader point here which you need to understand, which is that wealth matters, wealth is real, and wealth comes with passive income. So if I, the government, own a lot of wealth, or if you, the middle class, own a lot of wealth, then you will be able to use that wealth to provide you with services, healthcare, education, housing. If you don't have those wealth, those assets, then you need to get that income from somewhere. You essentially have a passive outflow. People who have wealth receive money from people who don't have wealth. When the government had wealth, then it had a passive income. Now the government, like the middle class, has debt, it has a passive outflow, and it needs to make up that money from somewhere, and it basically has only three choices, right? Either it gets that money back from the very rich, who are getting richer, it gets that money by taxing significantly more working people, or it gets that money by reducing what it provides in public services. So I think it's relatively simple to understand wealth matters, wealth has passive income. If the government is less rich from a wealth perspective than it was previously, it simply has to either cut your public services or raise your taxes. And that is why we are now in a situation where we have record high levels of taxes on working people, not on the super rich, while simultaneously an extremely decreased quality of public services. And it's important to recognise that whilst this is probably most advanced in countries like the UK, although I suppose some other countries like Greece might want to put their hands up, this is the direction of basically every Western government, because as wealth is decreasing, it becomes increasingly more and more expensive and difficult for Western governments to provide you with public services, and they will increasingly be forced more and more to cut your public services and raise your tax. I think the real key point to understand here is changes in the wealth distribution and changes in wealth inequality basically destroy what might seem like obvious link between the level of tax that you pay and the level of public service you receive. It may seem obvious that if you pay more taxes, you should get high levels of public services, but if the higher tax is coming simultaneously along with a massive transfer of wealth from the government or from the middle class to the super rich, then this increase in tax will be needed simply to make up the changes in passive income. So just to crucially nail that, changing wealth inequality totally delinks the connection between public services and tax. It increasingly is true that the tax that you pay is not going towards providing you with public services, it is going towards paying debt interests, primarily to the richest people in the world. So that is the point. You simply cannot get the same level of service for the same level of tax now that the wealth distribution has significantly changed. If you want to fix that, you need to move the wealth distribution back. And what that means is getting wealth back from whoever has received it back towards the working class, the middle class, and the government. Well, who has got it? We know very clearly that government wealth has collapsed. I think if we look at the position of the working class, we can see very clearly 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was ordinary for working class people to accumulate wealth and own homes. That's no longer true. So they haven't got the wealth. The middle class is increasingly finding it difficult to buy property. They haven't got it either. So it is pretty clear that the people who have accumulated the lost wealth of the government have been the rich and the very rich. So this is what I mean when I say you have three choices. And this is basically how I have been able to correctly predict the failure of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer in this country, and how I know with certainty that Andy Burnham will fail if he does not take action on this rapidly changing wealth distribution. We can see very clearly that if wealth is being transferred quickly from most of society to the very rich, this new passive income, which has to go from society to the rich, must be found from somewhere. And for a long time, this money has been made up by increased borrowing. And I think we can see in 2008 crisis, also in the 2011 European sovereign debt crisis, or in COVID, the ways that all of these crises, I think, can be viewed as crises of inequality, crises of distribution. We can see in hindsight all of these crises made the very rich much, much, much richer. This leads to the situation where society has to find from somewhere the money to pay the newly much richer, very rich, this new higher amount of passive income. And basically all of these crises have been dealt with by increased levels of borrowing. So if suddenly you're poorer, they're richer, you need to pay them more passive income every year. One thing that you can do is you can borrow more in order to pay that passive income off. The problem is, of course, if that is the cycle that you get into, then you should be able to kind of quite easily see that this will lead to a kind of exponential growth cycle, which is they're richer now, you're poorer now. The way that you deal with that is by borrowing from them. You know, this is like if you borrow money from a loan shark, you can't afford to pay the loan shark the interest back. So you borrow the interest from the loan shark. You know, your debt is going to grow more and more in an exponential fashion, because that is how compound interest works. Their wealth is going to grow more and more. And really, that is completely how we end up in this situation where government wealth doesn't just fall a little bit, it very, very rapidly falls to zero. And you know what is happening here with Western governments and what's happening in the UK government, you hit that point eventually where you've sold all your assets, you've gone dramatically into debt, you've sold the family silver, and the rich will keep lending to you as long as you have assets, because they know that they can eventually force you to sell those assets to them in order to pay the debt back. But eventually you end up in the point where we are now. I think the UK government kind of hit this point early last year, 2025, where the rich, or the people who manage their money, which is financial market traders, basically say, well, you don't really have any assets left, you're already massively in debt, your economies are not growing, we're not going to lend you anymore. And then what you have is, you've postponed, once your wealth situation worsened, you should have immediately taken a hit to your living standards. If you're poorer, you should feel poorer, you should have worse lives. If they're richer, they should feel rich, they should have better lives. But that can be postponed by either accumulating debt or giving your assets over. I was thinking about calling this video the unbearable sweetness of giving away your assets. Because I think what you've seen here is really sort of 20 years of pain, of they're getting richer, we're getting poorer, but we don't feel it because we keep borrowing money from them, delayed and kind of hitting you at a certain point. And it reminds me very much, really, of governments doing what, in a sense, the Western working class, or middle class if you're American, did in 2008, which was, what you're kind of seeing here in society is an attempt to balance a couple kind of powerful economic forces, which is ever since the 80s, when we dramatically cut taxation on the richest. As soon as you do that, because the rich are very rich and have very amounts of passive income, as soon as you cut their taxation, they start to accumulate these enormous amounts of money. And what they want to do with that money is they want to buy up all of the assets. And you see the distribution of society change. And that should cause the distribution of consumption to change. And it should cause very quickly ordinary people to get poorer and poorer and poorer. But richer people, because they have what we call a low marginal propensity to consume, which means when they get money, they tend to buy assets. If you allow them to get rich, they don't initially come for your living standards. What they come for in the first case is they come for your assets. And they will allow you to continue having good living standards as long as you give them your assets. And this can basically come in two forms, which is one, the handing over of your real assets. You don't own a home anymore. The government sells off all the schools and the hospitals and the football pitches. Or two, you simply accumulate large amounts of debt. And I think what we saw in the 2008 crisis and the run up to the 2008 crisis was one way of threading this needle, which is how can we allow the rich to get richer and richer and richer and richer without the poor getting poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer in terms of living standards. One obvious way to do that is to just massively increase the amount of debt which poor and ordinary people are in to the rich. And you see that in the run up to 2008. That's really why you see house prices rise so much, because there's a massive increase in lending from the rich to the poor. And then the Western middle class hits in 2008, the same point that the British government hit in 2025, and which other Western governments will hit over the coming years, which is suddenly your Western middle class has given up its assets significantly, has gone into debt significantly to the rich, and the rich suddenly say, all right, we're not going to lend money to you anymore. And then suddenly the real consequences of increased wealth inequality have to be seen, which is we are no longer going to let you have your comfortable middle class life because we've already taken your house, we've already put you in debt, you've got no more wealth to offer us. Now, all of a sudden, you have to accept dramatically increased poverty. And really, those are the only three ways which a massive increase in inequality can play out, really. You either have like 2008, where some group in society is like forced to stop consuming, and you have this massive economic crash because suddenly, a massive chunk middle class of society can't consume anymore, jobs disappear, the economy collapses. Or you get this sort of what happened in the aftermath of 2008, which is the interest rates get cut incredibly low, suddenly the rich have tons of money to buy up all of the assets, asset prices get pushed up enormously. Or you get this situation which we kind of get after COVID, where because all of the kind of weak hands in terms of asset ownership, I like to think of sort of my dad's generation, this sort of Western like middle group, as this really weak hand of people who had assets and incredibly easily gave up their assets. Once you no longer have any regular people who are willing to give up their assets, you kind of have this conflict, which is the rich cannot stop buying because they're so incredibly rich. Their passive income is so incredibly high. Their tax take is so incredibly low. They have to keep buying. They have to keep buying. This is why I used to wear that no-face t-shirt from Spirited Away. If you've never seen Spirited Away, fantastic Japanese movie. There's this one sort of monster. He can't stop eating. He can't stop eating. He eats everything. He eats everything. As long as we have this super rich class that cannot stop massively increasing their wealth, some group in society needs to be willing to give up their wealth. Otherwise, and we had the Western middle class, and now what we have is Western governments. Otherwise, what you will simply have is this enormous increase in asset prices because there's no sellers and the rich have this phenomenal amount of money. And then what that leads to is the thing that we started to see after COVID, which is asset prices go up so quickly that the sort of net wealth, the paper wealth of the billionaires starts to rocket up so quickly. They become so phenomenally rich that they then start to increase their consumption. And that is when you move into what we are kind of moving into now, which is like the kind of new Gilded Age where the rich are so incredibly rich and their consumption is so incredibly high that you get these insane things like Jeff Bezos renting out the entire city of Venice for a weekend, or the entire economy being transformed into them building their own data centers and then building their own rocket ships. And you get this slow transformation into basically the entire economy will transform to more accurately represent the new wealth distribution that we are in. So I'm often reminded, and I use it quite often, of this Bible story of Jacob and Esau, which is it's in the Old Testament, one of my favorite testaments, where you have an older brother who's like a sort of big, like hunky, musty hunter guy, and you have a younger brother who is more of a sort of Michael Corleone, like a younger, skinnier, but smarter guy. The older son has the inheritance. He comes home after hunting one day, he's starving. The younger brother has like a little bowl of porridge. And the older brother says, give me that porridge. The younger brother says, I'll give it to you if you give me your inheritance. And the older brother says, yeah, fine. And then that's it. And now he's poor now. This is really what happened to the Western middle class, really, which the Western middle class had a good, comfortable position. They had wealth. The Western middle class, the Western working class had wealth. Western governments had wealth. And then the super rich kind of used their control over economics and the media to say, hey, how about you just massively cut our taxes? And, we will then give you money in the short term. And in the long run, we'll get your houses, we'll get your government assets, and you'll be in debt. And that works for sort of 30 years as you run your wealth down. This is why I was thinking about the title, The Unbearable Sweetness of Losing Your Wealth. It feels great to give your wealth away. If you are somebody who owns a house and the house is worth £500,000, if you sold that house now and you use that money to rent and go on holidays and go on, ski holidays and have a great retirement, your life would be great for 20, 30 years, but then you'd have no wealth and you'd suddenly be poor. This is basically what we have allowed to happen to the Western governments and Western middle class. And then now we're at this situation where because your government has no wealth and because you have no wealth, the only way for you to get the things which used to be affordable to your parents' and grandparents' generation is for you specifically to pay enormous amounts of tax. And the only way which you could resolve that, the only way which you could fix that would be to restore the wealth distribution to something like it was 20, 30 years ago, which means you need to somehow get back enormous amounts of wealth from the really very rich, especially these centimillionaires, these billionaires, and there is no way to do that other than significantly increasing their tax. So if you want you and your family and your community to pay less taxes, there is no way to achieve that other than to significantly increase taxes on the very, very rich. I think ultimately beneath this, there's a kind of like simpler truism, which is something I think is important for you to understand, which is that ultimately wealth is power, and it is the power to consume. If you have wealth, then under a free market capitalist economy, you will always be able to have a decent life as long as you have wealth. But once you lose that wealth, then it is very easy for you and your community. I think anybody who's experienced poverty will know this. It will become very easy for you suddenly to not be able to have any access to the things that you need: healthcare, education, housing, even in increasingly common cases, energy and food. If you allow yourself and your community to lose your wealth, which unfortunately here in the UK most of us already have done, you will lose your power, and you will lose your power to consume. I'm always reminded when I tell this story of Mr. Beast. I mentioned Mr. Beast before, did I? Yeah, I mentioned it recently, but I'll mention it again because I think it's really relevant for this story, which is whenever I think about like the situation of the Western middle classes and how they have and are continuing to allow their wealth position to be eroded away, and I'm often quite naive about what that's going to mean for their like long-term living standards. I'm always reminded of this thing which Mr. Beast, I presume he doesn't still do it, when he used to go to Africa and pay, really shockingly small amounts of money to allow, blind children in Africa to have their eyesight back. And I'm always reminded of the fact, which is important for you to recognize, that there are still big parts of the world where ordinary people like you and I, who may be born with incredibly curable blindness, do not receive very cheap and affordable healthcare to bring their eyesight back. What that tells you there is capitalism does not provide, in many cases, even the most basic of essentials to people who do not have a strong wealth position. And it's easy to forget that in the Western country. Obviously I'm talking to you here from London, because we have created in the last 70 years situations where you have large wealth-owning middle classes. And what that means is you have a lot of consumers, you have thriving economies, you have a lot of jobs, and that has meant that most of, especially these basic essentials like food and housing and basic healthcare and energy have been available to most British and Western people for a long period of time. But you need to recognize, as wealth inequality in the UK and in other Western countries increases very quickly, we are moving towards the kind of wealth distribution which has been common for a long time in places like Africa. And as we move towards the wealth distribution of places like Africa, in many ways, our economies will start to look like what they look like in these places where you are dependent on an American billionaire YouTuber coming over and deciding to, like Jesus, touch you on the head and give you your eyesight back. If you don't have wealth, then you don't have power, then you lose your ability to consume basic things. And I think it's really important to look at those other parts of the world and remember that that kind of poverty has existed here in the West. And as we allow ourselves to move back towards the kind of wealth distribution that is common in places like Africa and places like India and much of Latin America, we will move towards economies that look more like that. And the kind of extreme poverty, which is incredibly common in places like India, will become and is becoming much more prevalent here in the UK, in the US, in Europe. And if you want to stop that happening, if you want to have good government services, and if you want to pay less tax, the only way to do that is to protect the wealth distribution, to protect the ability of ordinary families and Western governments to own their own wealth. And the only way to do that is to tax the very rich. The only way to pay lower taxes and have better services and better consumption for ordinary families is taxation on the very rich. All right, I've got here, as I always have, ending of hope. You know, it's easier to be hopeful at times like this. Those of you in the UK will be aware that we have been celebrating our annual Gary Stevenson week, where everybody in the country chats a lot of shit about me. And to be honest, when something like that happens, it's easy to be hopeful because I think it just shows you how scared they are of us and how far we've come. We here in this kitchen and you guys watching, and obviously especially all of the guys who fund on the Patreon, and all of the amazing people who help us. Gabriel Zuckman's done amazing work, especially this year. Patriarch Millionaires, Rebecca Gallant, the Patriarch Millionaires, Tax Justice UK, so many people. We've changed the narrative on this, and you know, I'm not hiding it. Next week is going to be my last video, but I can end this with the confidence that I genuinely believe that this argument will never go away now. Even if I were to never make a video again, we have lodged this idea, this true idea, that the reason living standards are falling is because of growing wealth inequality, and the only way to stop that is serious taxation of the very, very rich. We have lodged this idea so far into the debate that it's not going to go away. And if I was to walk out and get hit by a bus after this video, I think here in this country, in the UK, in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada, across the world, people would still be demanding wealth taxes in 10 years. That is how far we have gotten this argument into the debate. And what that means to me is we have to get it. And I don't think we'll necessarily get it in the next couple of years, although obviously I'm working incredibly hard to do that. I'm going into Parliament today after this to do my best to lobby for it. But if Burnham doesn't give it to us, he will fail on the economy. Because this transfer of wealth will keep happening, and then they will continually be forced to find that money from somewhere, which means they'll continually be forced to raise your taxes and to cut public services, which will mean he will be unpopular and he will fail. And if that happens, we'll still be here. And then Farage will win the next election and he will cut taxes on the rich, living standards will fall further, and we will still be here. And those predictions will be right, just like the predictions that I made 6 years ago when I started this channel were right. So really, all I ever wanted to do is just have this understanding lodged absolutely firmly in the minds, in the consciousness of ordinary working class people here in Britain. I know we get watched all over the world now, US, Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. As long as you understand that the reason living standards are falling is because of growing inequality, and as long as you understand that simple thing, share it with your friends and families, and say it again and again, then everybody will be able to understand that when new politicians come in, and I sorely hope Burnham does something on it, but if a new politician like Burnham comes in and does nothing about inequality, you will know in advance that he will fail on living standards. And then when he fails on living standards, you will know why he failed on living standards. And you'll be able to tell your friends and families before it happens. If he doesn't do anything, he will fail on living standards. And then when he does fail on living standards, everybody is going to know why. And I think the situation we are in right now, this unifies the economic interests of 90% of the British public here. And the same is true in Italy and Spain and Germany and America and Australia and New Zealand and Canada and all of these countries. We have so much political potential here, just as long as you understand this very simple economic message. Your living standards will continue to fall until we stop wealth inequality from rising. And you know, I've got to be honest, I don't enjoy our annual Gary Stevenson week, which we seem to celebrate as a festival here in the UK. I don't enjoy some of the nonsense that gets spoken about me. But I recognise that even if everybody hates me, it doesn't really matter, because it gets people talking about this very simple thing, which is true, which people won't forget and which people will remember, which is if Andy Burnham and if Nigel Farage and whoever is the next the US president, whoever is the next fucking German chancellor, whoever wins the election in New Zealand, if they do not take action on inequality, living standards will fall. And as long as people know that in advance, then this project has to win. Because every single time a new prime minister, a new French president, a new US president doesn't do it, everybody will know in advance, and when it happens, why they will fail. All right, so what I want you guys to do is stay calm, speak to each other, make things. Really, when I made my documentary, one thing which really struck me was I tried to ask everybody, like, do you feel optimistic about the future? Do you feel hopeful? And what I found was the people who felt hopeful were, in almost every case, people who were doing something. You don't need to change the world by yourself, but you do need to just take action. Do something small, arrange some kind of event, make some kind of creative project, you know, make a video, make art, you know, make a song, make music, arrange a cultural event, you know, just get your friends and family together and watch the fucking documentary. When I say that, it doesn't even need, in my opinion, for you to really move the dial. But I think it is that taking of action, it is that stepping forward and doing something with other people, which is gonna make you feel strong and it's gonna make you feel hopeful about the future. You know, we live in this world now where a lot of like bullshit gets like thrown on the internet at people like me. But when I go out there on the streets, I get treated like fucking Robin Hood. You know what I mean? What I wanna say is, you're in this together. You're in this together, regardless of what colour or religion or age or where you're from, whatever country you're from. We are facing the same problems of falling living standards due to increasing inequality. And if we can stand together and educate one another, we will win. And if we are driven apart and we hate one another, we will lose. So that's it. One last video after this. I'm incredibly looking forward to being done. I'll finish on just a simple quote, which is the best way to change the world as just one person is to not be just one person. Come together. Tax wealth, not work. Thank you.